Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
But I want to welcome the program author Greg Bellow of Saul Bellow's Heart, a son's memoir. Greg, thanks for calling.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Enjoying talking to you off air about this is your first time in the Miami Book Fair, so you're just amazed, aren't you?
I am amazed at how big it is, how well organized, how many people are here. I've had some fascinating conversations downstairs, and sure enough, here I am on the radio with you.
Absolutely, and then it just keeps on going for sure. And Greg, is this your first book fair altogether, or have you been at other book fairs?
Well, I was at the Chicago Book Fair a few months ago, but this dwarfs it.
Oh, it definitely does, for sure. I think it's the largest. My LA friends, Greg, because I do a lot of late-night interviews with LA authors all year round on Author's Corner. They try to tell me the LA Times is like this, but there's nothing like Miami, in my opinion, for sure. So, Greg, kind of talk to us about the book, and especially about Saul Bellow and stuff like that, and then we'll get right into Eric's question.
Well, I wrote the book so that people would get to know Saul Bellow in a way that I thought only I could show and demonstrate. He was a very private man, and he felt that privacy was essential to his writing, and so he preserved his privacy as best he could. And during his lifetime, I very much subscribed to the idea that writing and the life and the work don't mix. But after he passed away, I began to rethink that. I reread his books, thinking about writing a memoir, and I realized that he crossed the line between life and art all the time. And so I decided I would write because I was not happy with the sort of portraits that I was seeing of him, which were all revolved around the famous Saul Bellow, not the private Saul Bellow.
Interesting, Eric. And when I'm reading the background and to learn about somebody that famous in so many ways as a writer, Eric, I think it's an interesting thing to hear for Greg to write this son's memoir.
Yeah,
sure.
I think it'd have to be exceedingly difficult just with knowing all the personal aspects of his life, and so many of the people that have probably written about him didn't know his personal life, and like you said, him being a private man and keeping a lot of that bottled up. It's got to be frustrating when someone's writing a book about your dad. And
well, it was frustrating because they didn't know him, or they knew approximations of him, or they were getting secondhand information. And it was more frustrating because I didn't think the pictures that they were constructing of him matched my experience even closely. And so I got perturbed, and I decided to write for that reason.
And it's something when you finally write it down on paper, you have to go back and think about your father and think about what you were so fond about him and also his history. Kind of go into digging up a lot of the history that might have not been known about him, right?
Well, that's true, and it's all firsthand. It's all through my eyes, and that's the way I wrote it. Somebody earlier was asking me a question, and I said, I just strung a bunch of narratives together. And it took a lot of work on the writing, a lot of work on the writing to make it coherent. But it basically is, it's a very subjective, firsthand, experiential book, and that's what I wanted to write. There are plenty of people who've done all sorts of research and read his books and looked in libraries and read all the the book reviews and the editorial stuff and the academic stuff, but nobody knew his person. So I decided I felt it was important that people do, or at least have the opportunity to learn about it if they wish to.
Absolutely, Eric. And that's the part about it. You got to share that information, share what's going on, and so people learn more.
Well, I probably wouldn't have shared it if I hadn't found, the portraits of him so inaccurate and distressing. That was really pushed me over the edge about deciding whether I was going to do this or not.
What was it like writing a book about your father, who obviously was a very skilled writer, and to take his life story and put it into a book? Was it overwhelming for you to kind of put that?
It was overwhelming for me, and I almost chickened out a bunch of times, to tell you the truth. But what I did is that basically I channeled my father. In other words, I adopted his writing habits, which meant getting up, having a cup of coffee, locking myself in front of a computer, which he mostly wrote by hand or on the typewriter, turning on, Mozart or Bach so loud that I blotted out everything, and spending 5 or 6 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week doing that for 2 or 3 years. And I felt very close to him as I did it. I mean, I could see the kind of emotions that you have, the kind of excitement that you have when you feel you've gotten something right. And also the frustrations like, oh, this is going to work out. And I'd hit some sort of snag, and I figured, why bother? But yeah, I felt I owed him a debt, and I felt that this book paid back some of it anyway.
A clinical psychotherapist?
Yeah, I was a clinical social worker, and I specialized in psychotherapy with troubled children.
Was this your first work, or had you written previous books before?
No, a few professional articles was all. No, this is my first book.
Wow.
I was reputed among my brothers to be the brother who didn't know how to write, which in fact was true. I basically taught myself how to write writing this book.
Wow.
Wow. And I started when I was 65, so, I was, both of my brothers were in the literary or, journalistic or literary field, and I was not. I followed more in my mother's professional footsteps. My mother was also a social worker. So I didn't have to write much. But, then I said to myself, look, I've been writing up people's life stories, my whole career, because that's what you do. It's part of my profession. And why can't I do that about my dad, I asked myself. And not knowing the task I'd assigned for myself, I did it.
What was the process like? Do you think you'll write another book?
I don't know. I was saying no to that question. It's been posed to me before, and I had a pat answer, which is I only had one dad. I certainly won't. There's no other memoir inside of me. But then people have said sort of interesting things. I mean, I know a scholar who's very interested in writing a book about my father's, what he thought about God. That's a very intriguing idea to me.
Interesting.
Yeah. Although I couldn't do that myself. I'd have to do that with somebody who was having a more scholarly bent than I.
What do you think is going to most surprise people about your dad's memoir?
I think how emotional. I think how important emotion was in his life. I mean, I describe it as his life as a sort of battle between his mind and his heart, and I say that I think the heart won out, and that's why I titled the book that I did. But when you read his books, you realize, what an intellect he was, and people sort of stop there. They don't ask themselves anything about they don't go beyond that, or they're not inclined to go beyond that, because it's so dazzling. I mean, his genius is so dazzling that people sort of get caught up in the heroism of powerful intellect. But I think that his basic message was that he wasn't really sure. I think he was sure that intellect doesn't answer the more basic questions in life. And I think he was very hard on a lot of philosophers, and that he had to take the trouble to explain what he thought they meant in the books before taking them apart or criticizing them. One of my favorite things is in Herzog. His narrator writes always letters to famous people, living and dead. And he wrote this letter to Nietzsche, in which he said, "I don't understand what you mean by the quotidian. And here's Moses Herzog trying to get through every day of life suffering, and he finds no solace in a 5-syllable word, that just means living every day, which is what he was struggling to do. And I think that there's an implicit criticism of abstract philosophy and rationality, excesses of rationality in there. And that's what I think people will find from thinking about his life for 5 years, for sure.
How's the book been received? Have you had a lot of positive comments about it?
I've had a lot of positive. I've had a few negatives. I think I irritated a bunch of Bellow hero worshippers. But mostly it's been very positive, and I've been very, very pleased. People understood. The thing that pleased me most was that people were saying to me, you didn't get carried away by the love, which would mean I would write an uncritical book, and you didn't get carried away by the hate, which means I would write an angry book. I really strove to maintain my emotional balance, and the responses that recognize that have been my favorites.
Well, and I think that what you learn from this process is just to take the good from the bad as an author. That's the thing. And I'm sure you learned a lot from your dad and his critics. And not surprised when you get the feedback either way, right?
No, I wasn't surprised. I knew that there were people who were, considered themselves or appointed themselves all Bellow loyalists, and were very angry that I had talked about what he was as a man, and that I should have just left it alone, and I should have just said, my father was a great writer, and worshiped the books and the sentences the way they do. But I think the more interesting question is what kind of a guy is capable of writing 13 major novels. That's a much more interesting question to me.
Definitely, and it's something that to be able to do that, to be able to be so talented and so great at this. When growing up with him, would you say that he was just so passionate of his work, and just that because you said you never wanted to be an author, Greg?
Yeah.
Did you see when how would he ever share with you all his, I guess, toil and again, and the love of his work, or did it something where he was kind of the person that didn't want to share all what he went through as a writer?
No, he didn't want to share it. As I said, he was intensely private, but I could see it. I mean, he didn't discuss it with me, but I remember him coming out of his study soaking wet. Winter or summer. I mean, it took that much out of him. And when I wrote and channeled him the way I did, I could see it myself. So, but it was not a subject of conversation. I saw him, and he knew that I knew, because I'd lived with it and I'd seen it. But it was not a verbal. It was a nonverbal form of communication.
So interesting, Eric, to learn about this, and I could see this if my kids will write a memoir on me someday, or they would write it, or I would write about my father. That ultimately, the way we learn things is through observation, Eric. It's not always about sharing, and I think a lot of fathers, in a lot of ways, and I'm sure Greg, you would agree with me as well. Especially working with children and things like this, and I guess I'll point this question to Greg and Eric. As an educator, Greg, I see a lot of times fathers don't want to share their work, share what they do, understand it. Do you think that sometimes hurts development in some ways when they're not sharing what they do as their life's work?
Well, I think it's important to know, what your dad does. I mean, you could bring him to show and tell day at school. What I would say about my father in this respect is writing was what was the most important to him. It really prevailed over everything else. And everybody had to learn that lesson. And everybody knew, that you didn't interrupt him when he was writing. And, when he got done in the studio, he was, he was quite accessible. So I would say, kids understand a lot of stuff intuitively. As I say, there's no secrets in a family. And so, you understand what your parents' attitudes are, even if you can't articulate it. And I certainly think, that it's very important, for people, to think about it and to think about, what am I going to do when I grow up? Should I follow? And I consciously chose to stay away from literature because I didn't feel I had the talent for it. By the time I was 25 or 30, my father was, had won the Nobel Prize. There wasn't any way I was going to compete with that. That's ridiculous.
Right.
So I just figured, okay, I would. And besides, my talents really lay more in the area of the heart than the head. So that's why. But I did give it a lot of thought as a young adult, a lot of thought, because I just wasn't sure I could see a path to it. But I found a path, and when I found a path, I was very tenacious. What's important, I think, about the similarity between my dad and I in this respect is the tenacity. It's not so much the content. Because I wanted to be a therapist, and I did everything I could to learn how to be a therapist, and he wanted to be a writer, and he did everything he could to teach himself how to be a writer.
Very interesting. Greg, where can we purchase your book and learn more about you so that our listeners...
Well, it's published by Bloomsbury, and it's available, I'm sure, on Amazon. There's an audiobook coming out, and it's called Saul Bellow's Heart, and you can order it or you can buy it in a bookstore. I tend to lean towards bookstores because I grew up in them. And they're having a tough time in the electronic age. So, but, people will do it. It's quite accessible. It's on the web. The publisher Bloomsbury has a website, and I'd be delighted if people bought it and thought about what I had to say, because that's why I wrote it.
Well, Greg, again, it was so interesting to learn about Saul and learn about, I guess, your toils of writing this book, and I hope great success and enjoy the book fair. Are you going to be participating in the book fair?
Yes, I'm going to be talking. I'm going to be talking with, and in fact, quite soon, with a woman who wrote something about Sylvia Plath, and a man who wrote something about an author whose name I'm afraid slips my mind. Both of whom suicided. The other two authors. My dad was way too lodged into the world to really do that. I mean, he enjoyed life way too much. But these other people were, troubled, and they wrote wonderful books, but it was in the mix of being troubled. And I think that's going to be the topic of today's conference.
Well, good talking to you, Greg, and best of luck to you. And
thank you very much for your time and your attention. And this charming woman's going to take the phone away, and then I'm going to go back downstairs and do what the rest I have to do.
Thanks, Greg.
Fantastic. All right, Greg.
Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and shall not be construed in any way as advice from Life Improvement Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by the producers, writers, or editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the expressed written consent of Life Improvement Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.